Today on the Midweek Move, we're going to look at another time that Jesus said, give him a sandwich. Hello and welcome to the Midweek Move podcast extension of The Healing Place. The podcast where we examine the scriptures line by line, verse by verse, and ask ourselves, what is happening here? And today, ladies and gentlemen, joining me today is our lead pastor here at The Healing Place, Pastor Scott. How are you doing, sir?
Doing well. Can't wait to dive into this.
It's going to be a great conversation. We ended last week's conversation by talking about Jesus going off to grieve, and it was kind of hit a very somber moment towards the end there. But that's part of life. That's part of the Christian experience. There's highs, there's lows. There's not always the bright-eyed, bushy-tailed moments, if you will. That being said, today we're going to look at what happens when Jesus does this. Now, for context, he just found out his cousin, a man he's literally known since before he was born, a man that leapt for joy when when Mary showed up, died tragically, murdered.
Yep.
By very cruel people, and he was an innocent man who was simply standing in the gap. This is a man that heralded Jesus is coming, prepared a way, and now he's having to grieve. So let's jump into this, because again, we jumped over to Matthew chapter 14, and we talked about how as soon as Jesus heard the news, left in a boat to a remote place to be alone. And so coming back now over to Mark chapter 6, verse 30. Pastor, let's jump into it.
Then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. There were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves.
Okay, so I know what you're saying, and you're going, Dallas, it doesn't say he did this. Well, again, this is where we have what we call the synoptic gospels. These things line up together. So what's interesting is with the situation, Jesus, it's very possible that he got the information about John the Baptist's death from his disciples who were coming back off of the quote-unquote mission field at this time frame. And it's interesting, though, that we see that while Jesus is going to grieve, he's also shown concern for his leaders, for these guys that he's been with. It says, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. He's showing care for these guys, while we know internally he's also needing to go off to grieve himself. As a leader, pastor, how do you manage to care for yourself while also being intentional about not allowing those you lead to burn out or to suffer too much themselves?
I think a good place to start with this question would be maybe for you.
Mm-hmm.
Is you've been with me for a long time. We've been through some pretty challenging things at times with people and families and situations, and as a church, and you've seen me not care for myself and care for myself, but you've also been on the receiving end of either my attention or my non-attentiveness to you as we're walking through things. So what would you say on the receiving end of this? How did you see me care for myself or grieve about something while also being intentional to make sure that I was paying attention to you all?
Mm-hmm. Because now I'm on the spot, but
that's right.
It wasn't in my notes. No. If we look back even at the last year, for those of you who missed it, back in May, Boss Lady took quite the tumble, and that required you to change up your lifestyle to handle a lot of things on your own. And the great thing for you was that we have a very unique team where we didn't skip a beat. We continue with life. Carrying each other. And a lot of what we did is because of the way that you have helped structure the culture of who we were as a group as a whole, where we're going to step in and we're going to handle things as a community. But throughout that time frame, while you're having to take care of your bride, and I remember you shared some stories from the pulpit about how there were moments where you're like, Lord, I don't know what to do. Even during that time frame, there were times that you regularly would check up on us as a team. I believe that within this time frame was actually where the conversation of how are you really, how are you, began to become a real thing here at the Healing Place also. And so I think there was a level of intentionality that you showed for us, just in small things over the last year of reaching out to us. Of course, we have a whole team as a whole. And so we've been able to shuffle some things around, some responsibilities to check up on each other. We have an amazing elder board. It's not the elder board that you guys hear horror stories, the quote unquote demon board or whatever trash people say. This is a group of men who genuinely love God and genuinely love people. And they love this church.
And during that time, we actually had 3 deaths of people that were close.
Yeah.
I think I've got this right. Mr. Denny, Tina Henshaw, and Miss Joy.
Yeah.
We had 3 that summer.
Yeah.
While going through that as well.
Yeah.
And I can think back to specific years, not to rehash things, but it is our story. But, 2016.
Yeah.
That was the summer of 2016. That was, I had to lead. There was no option.
Yeah.
I couldn't catch away.
Yeah.
And get by myself. For that whole summer, it really was a 24/7 mindset. But I remember the day I crashed. And so during that time, I was going through personal betrayal, personal hurt and loss, super intense.
Yeah.
While at the same time trying to lead a whole community of people through their own personal healing, but then also healing as a whole, but then also not being so transparent that we're putting it on people who have no clue.
I think it's a key thing right there where you said not being so transparent, we're putting it on people who have no clue. I think a lot of people, when in the midst of their grief or in the midst of their own trauma, they put things on people that they don't need to put on. And it's a whole conversation you and I have had about knowing where to put people. And we get angry that people don't carry things when there was never their place to carry them to begin with.
That's right.
Normally that conversation relates around people putting too much on children. I think it was you or Tanya that shared a story about how the girls didn't know when you guys were poor. They were excited to have spaghetti. Right. They didn't even know it was ramen.
They thought everybody ate that. Like that was like, wow.
Right. I had a friend of mine in high school in college. And man, her parents were great. They were broke. They were so poor they couldn't afford the rest of the word. It was just po. And she had no idea how poor they were. Yep. Her parents loved her. They cared for her. There were just things that she didn't have, but they didn't know. She just knew that her parents took care of her. Yeah. But that goes beyond that. In leadership, there are things there have been things in the last year that you've shared with me about stuff that you've had to handle over the last 15 years. I just didn't know. And I'm okay not knowing a lot of things. I really am. I have the mentality of you give me my marching orders, I'm going to go, I'm going to handle what I'm going to do. Yeah. From kids church to youth ministry to media ministry, now back in youth ministry and media ministry at the same time. I'm concerned about the sheep that you've given me to handle, the plot of land that I have to handle, my lentil field. And I'm going to handle what I need to handle. If you need me to do more, I'll do more. But I'm going to handle because this is my focus right now. Yeah. And you've shared some stuff about stuff that was happening outside. And I have no idea what you're talking about. Yeah. My concern were the kids in this situation here. My concern was, making sure the Facebook stream didn't crash on us and we're getting spammed by terrorists. I don't know.
Yeah. But it's a balance because you still have to walk out your own personal stuff.
Sure.
Because then you're going to be a terrible leader if you don't.
Right.
You're not going to be good for anybody.
Right.
And so you still have to, and that one summer, I knew that I would not have the time, nor was it the time for me to catch away.
Right.
And I remember there were times when I tried to catch away and then I would see something, which is what we're about to see. Right. And this is exactly what's happening.
Right.
Is Jesus he wants to catch away and be alone, but yet he sees his apostles and disciples are in need. But now he's about to see the multitudes and have compassion on them. I believe Matthew's gospel says that.
Mm-hmm.
He had compassion on them. And so he can't catch away.
Right.
Doesn't mean that he's not going to, but it means in that moment, that wasn't the Father's will for him. That was something that the Father wanted to do.
Mm.
And that's where we have to discern what is God and what is not.
Mm-hmm.
And for that one summer for us, it was the Father's will that I needed to be able to just lead everybody through it.
Right.
And when we got through it, and I remember it, I remember it, man, I can see it as a clear picture. It was August of 2016, toward the end. It was hot, man. It was scorching hot. And I was mowing the yard because it was something that didn't get done because I was so busy. And I was mowing the yard, and I had led that whole summer and just led everybody through it. And I had my Oakleys on that wrap around your head. And, you know, I was just sweating, and I was mowing my yard. And I get to this last piece of grass, and I mow it, and I let go of the throttle, and the mower goes off, and I fell on the ground and just started weeping, like openly sobbing.
Yeah.
To where probably the neighborhood heard it. And I remember my head was down, and I remember that I was crying so much that the tears had pooled up in my glasses, my wraparounds, and were coming out of the wraparound glasses. Tears were coming out. And all of a sudden I felt these arms come around me, and it was Tanya. And I was like, after about 5 or 10 minutes, I said, "How did you get here so quick?" And she said, "I actually was standing on the porch watching you." She said, "I knew this day was coming this summer at some point."
Yeah.
And I just asked the Lord, "Lord, show me when the day was." And she said, "I knew today was the day." And she said, "So I've been watching you." And it was just like this thing of like, that was my moment to catch away and be alone.
Mm-hmm.
But even in that catching away and being alone, I wasn't alone.
Yeah.
Because my wife had come alongside of me then to carry what I had carried for everybody else for a whole summer.
Yeah.
She was there to carry for me.
Yeah.
And that's the way the Lord does it. And I think discernment is really, really key, because we will burn out if we just keep going.
Yeah.
But if it's the Father's purpose and will, we'll see right here of how God is going to use, the Father is going to use a moment of disaster and tragedy and grief, then to not misdirect their attention of needing to grieve, but God was going to show them the bigger picture.
Right.
And he was still going to allow for them to be able to grieve. But they needed this moment because the Father was going to do something pretty awesome.
Absolutely.
Verse 33, "But the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. They arrived before them and came together to him. And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them." Here he is. He's needing to get away by himself,
Right.
and just to grieve this thing. And yet he's moved with compassion for them because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things.
All right, cool. So Mark uses some very interesting language here to express how Jesus viewed people. He seems to be quoting Ezekiel 34, verse 5. It says this: "So my sheep have been scattered without a shepherd, and they are easily prey for any wild enemy or animal." Contextually, this is a description of the state of Israel before the messianic hand of the good shepherd appears to care for all of Israel. Now, while he doesn't explain this to the Gentile Christian audience that he's writing to here, this does show us his understanding of Jesus as the promised Messiah. And I want to point out this. We kind of made a conversation last week about the difference between intellectualism and emotionalism, and how even amidst intellectualism, there's still emotionalism here. Jesus is being emotional here. You know, he's having to walk through some stuff, but he's showing compassion to people. He's seeing them, and he has compassion on them because he sees them as what they are. As him, as the good shepherd, he's seeing people who don't have someone to truly guide, because they are open to what the wild animals or the enemy of the world would have for them.
So when the day was far spent, verse 35, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat."
All right, so at a quick reading of this, it's going to sound like disciples are being dismissive. They're like, "All right, Jesus, let's tell these people to go away." But it really does simply show that there's a practical concern here. These people have got to eat, and they're in a wooded area. There's nothing around, and so it's going to take a while to disperse this large crowd to find the substance that they genuinely need. Let's continue on, Pastor.
But he answered and said to them, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat? But he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish.
All right, so Jesus' response is interesting because he's challenged his disciples to provide for them. Now, that 5 loaves are the 200 denarii, this is like 8 months worth of wages that they're saying would it cost to feed all these people. My question for you, Pastor, is why is was their response unreasonable to Jesus?
No.
This whole, because I mean that's a lot, obviously.
But it was very practical.
Right.
I mean, they're seeing it in a very practical way.
Right.
Jesus also is, but he's also seeing something else, which is probably the second question.
You're right. So the question is, why would Jesus challenge them in this way if it's not unreasonable for them to go, we can't do this?
So I believe the challenge comes in making it almost an impossibility.
Okay.
Therefore, setting up what's about to happen.
Okay.
Because, again, they're like, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat? Like, this is a big deal.
Right.
This is a lot of people. And then when he says, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. When they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. So there was something they had to actively do.
Right.
That didn't look like it was going to provide provision.
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus isn't removing practicality from the supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
It goes together.
Right.
A very practical step taken, although it may not meet the full need,
Mm-hmm.
is opening the opportunity for the supernatural.
Right.
All we have, many of the Gospels say, all we have, they're basically saying this is not enough.
Right.
So we need to go buy more, but all we have is 5 and 2. Because
Right.
Jesus said, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. Basically, go out amongst the people, find out how much we have. 5 and 2. That's all we have.
Right. That's it. And it is a daunting thing to look at. You're going, and like, go back to our conversation of 2016. There was only so much we had in that moment. And it was like, there were real conversations that people were having to have. Celeste and I were married for 3 months. 3 months. And I had to go to Celeste and go, hey, we may have a problem.
Yeah.
And she's asking some real questions. I'm asking some real questions. We're going, do we need to go make other provisions for things? It's a real thing. Now the Lord provided miraculously. There was a lot of miracles that took place this season.
There was practicality too.
Yeah.
Because during that time, I had looked at everything and said, look, the Lord doesn't want us to put ourselves under anybody's, to be indebted to anybody.
Right.
And so that first week, I made the decision, everyone's getting what they're supposed to have.
Right.
Because within 2 days, I think, was payroll. Everybody's going to get what they have coming, except myself and Matt.
Mm-hmm.
And then by the next week, that was taken care of.
Exactly.
So it was practical, but at the same time, we were praying and fasting and hearing from the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, okay, make this decision, which seemed like a practical decision, but at the same time, there was supernatural on the backside of it.
Right.
Because by that next Sunday, supernaturally, God just provided.
Right.
And there was stuff just happening, which in that situation in the natural should have never happened.
Exactly.
Should have never happened.
Right.
But that's where us doing the practical
Mm-hmm.
and praying and fasting and doing the practical opened the door for the supernatural.
Exactly. Exactly.
Verse 39, then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks in hundreds and fifties.
All right. So Jesus' instructions to sit down are interesting. It mirrors the Mosaic instructions that we see in the book of Exodus when God's people were in the wilderness. So if we could speculate for a moment, Pastor, what could Jesus be suggesting by putting people in this grouping while together?
Over 30 years of study, I believe it is the analogy that he is the good shepherd,
Mm-hmm.
that he would make them to lie down in green pastures.
Mm-hmm.
They're in the wilderness, yet they sit on green grass.
Mm-hmm.
Yet they're in the wilderness.
Right.
He will make you to lie down in green grass, and then also taking them back to the Mosaic instructions
Mm-hmm.
of saying, I'm the greater Moses.
Right.
I am the good shepherd.
Yeah.
And so whether he was telling them or not, he was telling them by the way that he was situating everything and the way he was situating everybody and the fact of the green grass in the wilderness in a place that shouldn't have had it.
Right.
He's seating them. And if you were one of those people that was in tune, you were probably like, oh, saying that he's the one.
Right. Like there's a lot of layers taking place in this. Just a simple moment of us eating dinner together.
Like he's fulfilling Psalm 23 right now.
Right.
Like that's what he's saying. It's not unlike in Luke 4 when he says, this scripture has been fulfilled and he sat down.
Right.
Basically, I am
Mm-hmm.
that prophecy.
Exactly.
And so whether he said it to him directly or not, he is saying that.
Right.
All right, verse 41. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed it, broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all. So they all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments of the fish. And now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. So
Mark goes on to describe the miraculous moment that takes place here and the abundance of the miracle. Now, almost to add drama to the story, the way that Mark writes this out, he finally puts out that there were 5,000 men, meaning, because again, in this time frame, you didn't count everyone. You just counted the men, the head of the household, meaning that potentially there's like 10,000 plus people in this moment on the side of a hill in green pastures in the middle of the wilderness and seated in rows of 150 and 500 present for this miraculous moment. So as a final question, Pastor, what about God's provision can we learn from this story?
I just really think it goes back, for me anyway, it just goes back to the practicality that sometimes people may look at the mundane things that we do out of obedience and faithfulness to God as just these normal things in the natural that we would do.
Right.
But when we do those things, it opens up the door for God to do what only he can do. It says literally, they went out amongst everybody, 5 loaves, 2 fish. Okay, this is what we've done. We don't have any other answers. If you're not going to let us go, and if we're not going to gather up 200 denarii from everybody, these traveling pilgrims who are actually traveling to give all they have for a feast.
Right.
Like, again, there's not just over 10,000 people in a field for no reason.
Right.
They're traveling.
Right.
These are pilgrims. And what they have is going to be given as an offering. So if we're not going to go out and get 1,000 denarii together, if we're not going to pull it out of our own sack, all we have is 5 and 2. How are we going to do this? And then Jesus says, okay, give me the 5 and the 2. They give him the 5 and the 2. He blesses it. He breaks it. Then he gives it back to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all, and they all ate and were filled. So the practical thing that they did, Jesus doesn't just take it upon himself to go, hey, I'm doing all this. He gives it back to them and says, you go do it.
Yeah.
And so it's like their practical steps opened the door for them to be a part of the miraculous.
Right.
And I think that that's a great lesson for us, is that sometimes we're always waiting for that big, glorious moment to happen. And somehow that's going to put the stamp on that's God.
Right.
But really, man, sometimes it's just going out and getting the 5 and the 2 and knowing that it's not enough.
Right.
And just opening the door for God. You said it earlier about my kids. They never knew that we were just scraping. They never knew that I was making $207 a week with no insurance, we had 2 car payments. At that time, we were running 2 households because we were still trying to sell a property from where we came from.
Wow.
We were in a 14 by 60 trailer that had a hitch on the front of it and had tires underneath it that was connected to the church by a walkway. There wasn't any getting away from the church people.
Right.
A 14 by 60 with 2 kids, and they had no clue. They had no clue.
Right.
They had no clue we didn't have insurance. They had no clue that at 2:00 in the morning with Liz and all of her 5 million ear infections, that we were praying, we were anointing her with oil, that we couldn't afford a doctor visit every 3 times. We couldn't afford a surgery every 3 months. We couldn't, that we were praying, we were believing God. We would take her to the doctor, the practical. We would do what we could in the practical, but yet it left room, and we were just obedient, and we were just faithful. Not great, not awesome, not perfect. We were just faithful with what we had. And even with that, when we were giving to the church, it wasn't like, okay, we can't because we're going to do without this. It was like, no, like we're going to give to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Not out of our abundance,
right?
But we're going to give out of our lack. And I'm not telling anybody to give if you don't have anything to give. What I'm saying for us, we were just doing the practical things of being obedient and faithful, just in the daily things. And in that, every single time, God opened the door for the supernatural to do what we couldn't do.
Right.
And that way, every time we gave the testimony, it wasn't about what we had. It wasn't about how wise we were or how much money we had or anything else. It was only accounted to God because he did it. And so for this right here, the disciples can't take any credit at all.
Right.
We don't even know how it happened. Jesus handed it to us, and it just kept coming, man. It just kept coming. And then even to the fact where they take up the 12 baskets full of fragments of fish, and that's a little bit of a, not contentious, but there's a little bit of differentiation in commentaries in that, because according to Hebrew culture, not necessarily law, but Hebrew culture, that if somebody provided that for everyone to partake of, if there was anything left, it went back to the host or the person who provided it, which from the Gospels we know was a boy.
Right.
So it would be that the disciples would be able to take of the fragments. They would also leave it at the 4 corners of the field for the widows and the orphans, and the boy would get it.
Right.
The boy gave it, but the boy got back, pressed down, shaken together, and running over that which he gave. And then the disciples were also a part of it just because they served in a practical way.
Right.
So I think just the practical things, man, never diminish. Do not despise the day of small beginnings, man. Don't despise just getting up, serving the Lord, praying your prayers, reading the word, being faithful to the Lord, just doing what you have the responsibility to do, and then God will open up the doors for the supernatural to happen.
Absolutely. Good stuff. Well, what are you looking for a miracle for? How can we pray with you? Reach out to us, mediahub@thpshreveport.com is how you can reach us. Check out our website, thpshreveport.com. We would love to worship with you. Come visit us at 8957 Kingston Road, Shreveport, Louisiana. We meet every Sunday at 10 o'clock and every Wednesday at 6:30. Until next time, have a great week.